So thanks, guys, so much for being here. So to start off with, just for folks who might not be as aware of the organizations that you both work with, I was wondering if you could give me, your sort of 2-second explanation of what they do. Maybe we'll start with you, Aisha.
No, definitely. Thank you for that intro.
Of course.
So I run an organization called Springboard to Opportunities. We're based in Mississippi, but we're a multi-state nonprofit, and we work directly with families who live in federally subsidized affordable housing. We're a direct service provider.
Okay, great.
So my name is Joe Huston, and I work at Give Directly, which is a nonprofit that delivers unconditional cash transfers. We've been working mostly in East Africa, in Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda. And this year we're launching a large basic income pilot in Kenya.
Great. And so it seems to me that actually, well, I guess maybe this is a good way to ask this. How many of the families that you're working with receive cash benefits?
Absolutely none, which, I'm the evidence of what cash would look like if my family's actually received cash. Because since we work in the area of federally subsidized affordable housing, all of our families live in extreme poverty. So we're talking about families, single mothers with 2 or more kids who are in essence making about $11,000 a year, but the $11,000 a year is all government subsidies. None of that is cash. So that's your housing voucher, your child care voucher, your SNAP benefits, your electricity voucher. All of that is included in your income per se, but it's not actually cash income. And based on the various systems and everything that are in play as it relates to welfare within our country, none of my moms actually receive cash.
Okay, got it. And Joe, of the families that you guys are working with, are they tend to receiving anything before you guys kind of come in and find them? Or are there sort of goods or services that they're provided either from other NGOs or from the government, Kenyan or Rwandan or Ugandan government?
It's highly varied. And so in terms of government cash transfers, there are big programs in Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda. The total percent of the population served is really low. And so on average in the areas we're looking at, it's maybe a few percent. And then people have really varied levels of interactions with other nonprofits. And so that could be a well that they pass every now and then has a chlorine dispenser, or a nonprofit built one house in the village, or everybody got pencils. It sort of varies a lot depending on the sort of village to village.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And so Aisha, in your assessment of the families that you're working with, and I know it can be hard to generalize, but even given the subsidies that they're receiving, what's the most present or most common need that they might have?
Cash.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, it rules everything around us. I mean, that's a really...
I think I've heard that. Yeah.
It's a great song. But, to be serious, think about just getting here today. How much of your interactions and how much of your life actually involved cash? So when you got in your car, that was cash to pay that car note. The gas, that's cash. If you stopped at Starbucks or wherever to get your shot to get you here and get your energy going, that's actually cash. So the reason we got involved in this UBI movement is because of the lack of cash that we were realizing were impacting our families negatively, and how that was really preventing us as an organization from living out our mission. And so initially we wanted to tackle it from a policy perspective, but we realized that the policies and the system as it currently relates, really create poverty traps. And so in looking at that and realizing that, okay, there's not a way for us to, in effect, work within these systems currently, how do we work around them? And that's when we discovered UBIs, and that's really how we got interested in this movement, because it comes up time and time again. Our families want less interaction with systems. They want less interactions with case management and people actually judging them. They just want the dignity to live their lives, and they feel that cash is what they need to help them do that.
Right. And so why is the system not working? If we have government programs that are saying we are going to heavily subsidize your housing, and that we are going to heavily subsidize your food or provide stamps for food. But seriously, like if somebody says, okay, I'm going to take care of the buckets of housing and food, right? That presumably helps, but then, why does cash remain the need? Why is the money not being, fungibly squeezed out for somebody who might not be as in the weeds as you are, as present with these families as you are?
Thank you, I appreciate that, and thank you for this soapbox that I am gladly going to get on. So I think there's a number of reasons that, the current welfare system doesn't work within our country. I think if we get baked really down to it, a lot of it is dealing with race and actually that ideal of deservingness and really the stigmatization that we put on poverty within this country. And quite frankly, it's too easy for us to make it their problem and those people. And when we have that lens and that narrative, it makes it, quite frankly, really easy for us not to act. And so when I mentioned earlier the poverty trap, for individuals who may not know what that is because you don't work and live in this space every day, basically when you are receiving government subsidies, it's based on your income. So every time your income goes up, everything else goes down. So you get a job where you're making $1,000 a month. So where at first, your rent may have not been anything, now your rent goes up. While your rent goes up, your SNAP goes down. While your SNAP goes down, you now have to figure out childcare because in a lot of instances, you can't get a childcare voucher. While you're trying to figure all that out, you also, at the same time, you're losing your voucher for your electricity. All of these things happen simultaneously and immediate. It's a 30-day windfall of negative things happening within your life. And if you've never worked, you've never had to navigate all of these systems, it's quite easy and it's quite easy and it's convenient just to say, you know what, I'm out. I wipe my hands of it. And so that's the way the system is currently set up. That's the way it's been for a number of years, quite frankly, since we started welfare reform. And I can go into a whole bucket list over lunch if somebody wants to talk about it, about the cluster fork that has been. And so, yeah.
Yeah. And so, Joe, what do you guys find that your families are spending their money on? Because I know Give Directly kind of constantly gets these questions of, aren't people going to waste it, or isn't it just going to help them temporarily? So how are they using it predominantly? And again, I know it can be hard to generalize, but.
Yeah, and so, the kind of meta point is, one of the best things about cash is that you can deliver one thing and then enable sort of a bunch of different priorities depending on the person. But I think some of the themes we see are, one, different types of improvements to housing. In Kenya, there's a pretty good example of how expensive it is to be poor, where in a lot of the places where we're working, people have thatched roofs, and those work, but you have to pay a lot of money to maintain them pretty frequently. And in the meantime, they're often leaking on you, and they can also sort of foster mosquitoes, which can lead to things like malaria. And so a pretty common purchase that people have when they receive about $1,000 from us is to turn their thatched roof into a tin one, which is a higher upfront investment, but much, much lower maintenance costs. Other types of things you see are a lot of livestock purchases, things like cows or goats or chickens. Little small businesses purchases, and so that could be buying a motorcycle and becoming the motorcycle taxi person in the village. It could be buying a cooler to transport fish from the lake to the market and become a kind of fish middleman, or buying fishing nets or fishing boats. All these sorts of little businesses that just require a bit of capital. And I think the last thing is sort of education and health. And so on education, secondary school in Kenya and other places isn't free. And so even for people who are living under $1 a day, some of their biggest expenses are going to school fees or uniforms or things like that. And then health is obviously pretty expensive as well. And so we've seen people pay for medicine or pay for a cataract surgery and see again, all these sorts of little medical expenses that come up in the course of living your daily life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I also want to, because Give Directly has started a project in the United States for the first time. Joe and I were actually hanging out in Texas last week to meet some of these families that were receiving things. And I know it's like quite early for that, but I was wondering if you could tell us what you're doing, and also if you're sort of saying similar things. And this is post-hurricane relief. Yeah. Right,
and so, for until, I don't know, 2 months ago, I probably would have said that there was no chance we would be operating in the US now. But what we're doing in East Texas is we're working in communities that basically got totally underwater by Harvey and passing out $1,500 debit cards, prepaid debit cards that can be spent on whatever. And so we've seen fewer cow and goat purchases, but you have seen a kind of similar theme in terms of enabling all of the sort of little things people need that aren't being fulfilled by other services. And so some people receive FEMA reports, some people didn't. Some people have family members nearby, some people didn't. And so you're seeing spending on things like Home Depot and Lowe's to buy sheetrock or nails or start rebuilding your house. a Texas steakhouse because they'd been living on Burger King and sort of fast food joints the whole time because they have to stay in hotel rooms. Gas and clothing to kind of get back to work. There's all sorts of little needs that I think kind of fall through the cracks of existing disaster relief. And we found cash, I think, really helpful for filling in those gaps, even though $1,500 is much smaller here than $1,000 is in Kenya.
Got it. And so, Aisha, I'm interested in when you bring up the idea of converting benefits into cash or providing benefits in cash with your client population, how do they respond to that? Is that something that they ask for? Is that something that's sort of like present in their minds to advocate for, given that they are, citizens and users of these programs, as not just sort of recipients?
Yeah, so with thinking about the population that we work with, they've not heard of UBI. But when we introduce the idea of, okay, what would cash mean to you and your family in addition to the other benefits that you have, of course they love the idea. And it really is about, using the cash and not even thinking about it long term, really looking at it as the short-term jolt that they need to help them get on a pathway to economic self-sufficiency. And the excitement of, I could really finally, go back to school or finish my degree, because even though our families, benefit from Pell Grants, like Joe was saying earlier, Pell Grants don't pay for the incidentals, so they won't pay for your uniform if you are a nursing student or your books or those things. So it's those things, but then also it's the pieces of their kids' lives that they haven't been able to participate in. So, my child could now possibly be a cheerleader because I could afford that $200 that they would need for that uniform and to participate. So it's really the excitement of being able to live the life that they see those people living, and the things that we really take for granted, because we've had all of these conversations with our families, what would it look like? And it's just the basic things that we take for granted. Wanting to go on, a vacation and not wanting to go to Paris on vacation. A family mentioned wanting to go to Tennessee. That's 3 hours away from Jackson, but not having the ability to go to Tennessee. So it's just those really small things that a lot of instances we take for granted that really improve your quality of life.
And so, Joe, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your donor community, because I know it has been difficult in some cases to convince people that giving cash doesn't mean that people are going to squander it. It doesn't mean that it's just going to kind of fall down this black hole. People say, well, there's an urgent medical need. Why don't we tend to that? Or why don't we deal with education as opposed to just giving people money? And so what's the kind of argument that you guys make that this is perhaps a more efficient and in some cases more effective way of helping people who are living in extreme poverty?
I think usually that conversation starts with the evidence. And so I think that watching the sort of basic income debate evolve has been interesting because it brought up all sorts of questions people have about cash in general. And a lot of those questions, at least globally, are close to settled. I read a review of something like 165 studies studying cash transfer programs all over the world. And we saw experience with that first, especially in terms of marrying it with a study, cash with a study, in Latin America and places like Mexico and Brazil. And then those results quickly got replicated in Africa, in Asia, and the sort of exact effects can vary depending on the context and the size of the cash transfer and its structure. Is it a one-time grant or is it a stream? But you see a lot of kind of consistent themes in very, very different contexts. If you give people cash, they spend it on things that improve their lives. And so you see things like increases in earnings or increases in assets, improvements in nutrition, higher sort of people using educational or health facilities more and things like that. And so it's sort of funny that our kind of social default is so far against cash when the backing for cash is much better than the backing for most of the things we do, both internationally and domestically. I think it's nice that sort of evidence base also marries with a kind of more logical or emotional appeal that so much of how we help people is rich people in London or DC sort of guessing at people's needs or guessing at the needs that they wish people had and sort of spending and planning for them. And it's nice to sort of give people cash and put the budget in their hands. And so one of the sort of really nice surprises over the last few decades is that the evidence backs that basic intuition that you really can trust the people you're trying to help themselves if you get them a bit of capital.
Mm-hmm. And Aisha, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on whether you think that, on kind of like the opposite evidence, right, the negative evidence, that these programs that come with a lot of requirements and a lot of different sort of testing, even things like work requirements, perhaps aren't actually having this sort of reform effect that people who implemented had hoped that they would have on their lives. So how would you explain that to somebody who says like, well, actually what we need to do is sort of give people a path to walk to get out of poverty, and that's going to mean making sure your kids are in school, making sure that you have a job, and all of those other things that tend to come with the programs that you're working with.
So what I would say to that is, have you had a conversation with the people who are impacted by these programs and really ask them what it is that they need and how these programs are impacting their lives? I was about to say I don't believe, but I don't know if that's true, so hold on. I would hope that the policymakers who are responsible in some form or fashion for some of the policies that we have are ineffective don't quite understand how ineffective they are. That's my hope. I hope that they are really just out of touch because they've not had conversations with the people who are actually impacted, so they don't truly understand the negative side effect of having work requirements and what that looks like. So for a perfect example, temporary assistance for needy family has work requirements. None of the families that we work with utilize TANF. And the rationale for that is not that they don't want to work, which would be the argument that people say, oh, they don't want to work. It's not that they don't want to work. The reason they don't work is that in a lot of instances, they can't find employment because it's not like, TANF helps you find a job. They can't find employment in the jobs that they can find are entry-level, medial employment that provide no benefits, no child care, any of those things. So you still have the other tiny foxes of life creeping in. So it's not providing all of the supports that families need to actually be successful, but at the same time, you're penalizing families. So with TANF, it's really easy to get sanctioned. And one of the sanctions that can come along with TANF is you lose your SNAP benefits. So why would you go possibly try to get TANF when you know you can lose your SNAP? You need SNAP because you have to feed your family. So we really have to look at all the pieces of the puzzle and not just the ones that are convenient for us to look at. So that's my hope, that they're just out of touch. And if anyone want to be in touch, they can call me. I got people. I have people.
And so in your client population, how much cash will a family have to use for its basic needs? Again, unrestricted, just cash, either from income or some other source.
It really varies. So we have some families who don't work at all. So, as it relates to governmental cash, they have zero. They may receive some family benefits from, under the table child support or a parent or an aunt or something like that, helping to support them. And then we have a lot of microeconomies that have come up in a lot of the communities that we work in where people braid hair and babysit and those things. But that's all under the table because you would have to report that. And how do you report income that varies from month to month, such as that? So, it really varies. We have, like I said, we have some folks who work and, have part-time jobs or full-time employment who are actually, able to get by, but a large portion of our population actually have zero cash on a month-to-month basis that they know is coming in and that they can actually depend on.
Right. And so, Joe, given that you have worked in a number of with extremely poor folks in a number of African countries, how much do you think that the lessons that you've learned there are applicable to an American context, given that an extremely poor person in Kenya is very different than an extremely poor person living in Jackson, Mississippi?
Yeah, and so there are obvious huge differences, and so I should say that from the front. I think so much of the debate about cash and the debate about basic income isn't operating at that level. It's not like, oh, I recognize that there have been 165 studies done all over the world that suggest we should just give cash, but the US is different. It's not sort of being that nuanced. It's making much sort of stronger claims about what humans are like. That if you give them cash, you can't trust them. They'll just drink it, or any modicum of security means they'll stop working. All of those things are pretty generalizable claims. And so I think that even now, without more studies in the US or elsewhere, I think you can sort of force those arguments to have to be more nuanced, and I think as a result probably knock down a lot of them, that the evidence on work effort internationally is very clear, that there's been no study that found reductions in work effort from the developing world, and if anything, if you do find a result, it's that you see increases in work effort. The evidence on temptation goods is very clear, that if any study that measured sort of consumption patterns in cash-receiving communities found that people spending on things like tobacco or alcohol either stayed the same or decreased after receiving cash transfers. And so, at least from the start, I think you can box in a lot of those arguments. And then I think there's a lot that will be different. The sort of opportunities available for people in the US, the ways that you would want to deliver cash, things like that. There's a lot that doesn't carry over as well.
Right. And it actually, oh yeah, please.
I actually want to jump on, not as it relates to Kenya or overseas, but when you, Joe, one of the pieces you were saying that often comes up, if people would misappropriate and use the cash incorrectly and, drink or whatever. And I think we can take it I think we have to go a layer deeper and say, okay, if people do use it incorrectly, if they are drinking or, take up what we would consider inappropriate behavior, why? So if you are constantly living in a situation where you have all of these stressors coming up against you, on Friday night I would be drinking too, let's be very clear. But we never talk about that. We just penalize people for making decisions that we wouldn't have to make because they live in situations that we don't have to live in, and that's not okay. So if people are using it inappropriately, instead of just judging that action, let's say, okay, why is this occurring? It's occurring because people are stressed out. Every day they are waiting for the other shoe to drop, and if you lived a life on the edge like that, what would your life look like? Let's be very honest and have some honest dialogue with ourselves about what that would mean for us.
Right. And I'd love to hear you respond to some of these arguments that get made about cash and work effort, because as you were pointing out, very often people lose jobs because they can't get to them, they can't find childcare. It's very, very hard to work when you are extremely poor. And also, there's some arguments about, well, if you provide a cash benefit and people choose not to work, that's not always necessarily the worst thing, especially if they have young children. And so, in your client population, in your experience, how do you think about sort of the cash and work effort question or equation?
I don't think they should go hand in hand. I think we should give people cash and get the hell out their way to do whatever they want to with it. Quite frankly, I think we have got to quit stigmatizing poor people for being poor. And when we put work requirements on that, for however we dress it up and however cute and flowery we want to make it be, that's all we're doing. We're stigmatizing and saying, okay, you don't deserve this because of X, Y, Z. And since you don't deserve this, I have it and I'm going to give it to you, but I'm going to make you jump through X, Y, Z hoop. So if you give me cash, if I choose not to work and watch my 3 kids, thank you very much. That's what I'm going to do. My 3 kids need me to watch them.
So we have a couple minutes for questions from the audience. Do we have a microphone? I think so.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to ask a little bit about the idea of need and need-based access to funds. I think it's something that comes up a lot and makes things a lot more complicated. And I know ideally maybe everybody would receive it, but if we're looking at transitioning programs or we have a limited set of funds and we're looking at making them impactful, how has need-based receiving or need-based giving come into your work? And could you speak to that a little bit, please?
That's you.
Yeah, I can sort of kick off. And I think a powerful argument for UBI is that we should be much more humble about our ability to find the neediest people. And so in what Give Directly normally does, sometimes we means test and try to find the neediest people. Sometimes we don't. But both in the development context and in the US, the sort of error rate of the average program at seeking those people out is enormously high. And there's cost to administer it, and those sort of costs sort of force people out from the program from the outset. And so with fixed resources, both within a country and internationally, there's a strong argument for trying to find the neediest people. I just think the sort of burden of proof would be to show me why that program would work, given the sort of general or average track record in aid, in social services, would suggest that it would work pretty badly.
you want to respond, or should we?
Oh, no.
My question is for Aisha. Did I say that right?
You did, thank you.
Okay. For me, I am actually a co-founder of an initiative called Time Banking, and it's to help all communities, but help themselves. And I feel that with universal basic income, it would be a complementary thing to time banking for communities to help themselves. But I do think that if you're going to have universal basic income, it should be put towards those needs that we need, like whatever, basic rent, paying the bills, electric bills, and those kind of things. So if we do it in a way where communities are helping themselves, when you were saying people are paying money for babysitting or help, doing each other's hair, all of that can be done within time banking, helping each other. I'm talking about lower to middle income families. Mm-hmm. If they work, it brings them up. You're working as a community, bring yourself up, mm-hmm. and have some of that additional thing for things you can't just magically get. So what are your thoughts on doing that? Because I know you said that universal basic income, we should just get money. But this way, it holds them accountable enough that, hey, you need to show us within your community that you can bring yourself up. So.
I think that's a great idea, but I still stand by my conviction that I think we have to trust people to understand that they are the author of their lives and they know what they need. And thank you. So, yeah. So I think, the time banking, I think that's a great idea. But when we start talking about, tying it to an actual need, that's very subjective. What I consider is that before becoming pregnant, I considered wine every Friday night a need. Some people may not consider that a need. So I think it's really subjective. And so we can't put those conditions on it, in my opinion.
Okay, great. Time for just a couple more questions.
Aisha, I really appreciated your point about how our current welfare system is based on racism and a real stigmatization of poor people, especially poor Black people. So can you extend that and talk a little bit about the anti-racist work we would need to do in our discourse and our culture in order to advocate for a universal basic income?
Oh, not in 3 minutes or less, no. Find me doing lunch and we can talk, but no. I mean, that's really cute. Talk about racism in 20 seconds.
I have another question here. What are your advice for those who want to start organizations like the ones that you guys are working for?
Oh, gosh. Ooh. So what's the advice for starting a nonprofit? Oh, gosh. So Springboard, the organization that I run, is a little under 5 years old, and I actually have the honor of being the founding CEO of that organization. So I would say put your life on pause for a couple of years and really keep your eye on your North Star and what it is that you're attempting to accomplish so that you don't stay off track, and have really generous donors and friends.
Yeah, I think really invest in sort of understanding the need and the solution. And so Give Directly came out of people in doing their sort of economics PhD and seeing all of this evidence on cash transfers and not seeing a nonprofit doing it. And I think that sort of expertise is really helpful, one, to make sure you're doing something good, and then two, to make sure you can talk about it well, sort of implement it well, all of those pieces along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you. I'm so short. I can't really see all of you, so can I just stay? Just so I can see you. Hi, thanks. I'm wondering if you think, how soon you think we can move away, or what the trajectory might look like from like donors needing to see the stories of the people who are receiving cash, because as it stands right now, it still sort of foments the same structures that we're living in now, where there's like a benefactor and then there's someone receiving. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would love that world. It feels like we're currently very far. So much of the defaults are against trusting people or just giving cash, and so it's almost silly that there have been so many studies on cash transfers, or that you have to keep telling the story of how well people spend it. You know, you don't question, we're considering giving this employee a bonus, but I'm worried they'll drink it. Like, all of these sorts of things are sort of strange and expose that we think about poor people in a really weird way. And so I hear you that it is bad that they have to justify themselves, and I think we should make it as much as possible to do the work of doing that for them. But I think the conversation has to move a long way before we're there.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, I'd like to thank both of you very much for this fascinating conversation and for running amazing organizations. And thanks to everybody for listening.
Thank you.